The year is 130 AD, in October. Along the Nile, close to Hermopolis. Under a blanket of moonlight, the obsidian waters mirror Emperor Hadrian as he submerges Antinous' head. The young man, known for his striking beauty, ceases his fight after 40 seconds. 90 seconds later, the last air bubbles surface. 3 minutes pass, and his form loosens into stillness. Yet, Hadrian maintains his grip, uttering ancient chants in tongues older than Rome itself, anticipating an event the Egyptian clergy had guaranteed, a transition at the threshold of life and the unknown. This act isn't precisely homicide. The Syrian sorcerer Pancrates had convinced him it was an apotheosis. The young man, a mere mortal in death, would ascend to godhood. His essence, snatched at the zenith of his final breath, was meant to infuse Hadrian with vitality. The emperor would seize decades of extended existence, while Antinous would command perpetual veneration. A win-win save for Antinous, whose consent was never sought. A faint luminescence appears in the water surrounding the corpse, or perhaps it's merely phosphorescence agitated by the current. Hadrian senses a peculiar transfer from the cooling skin into his own being. Or perhaps that's simply the adrenaline of a killing, cloaked in spiritual rite. When he at last lets the body drift away, he firmly believes he has assimilated 2 decades of youthful vigor. The officiating priests affirm the ritual's triumph. To imply otherwise would be perilous. Hours later, Hadrian proclaimed Antinous a deity. Days later, a city began to materialize on that very site. Within months, orders for 2,000 sculptures were placed. The Roman Empire would soon adore a boy whose demise had been meticulously orchestrated over 18 months. A clandestine manipulation of esoteric faiths that transformed an act of murder into a sacred dogma. What truly distinguishes this episode, however, isn't that it's another familiar tale. We're not discussing Nero's infamous lyre playing amidst a burning Rome, nor Caligula's bizarre decree of war against the sea god Neptune. This isn't Commodus's descent into gladiatorial combat, or Elagabalus's controversial marriage to a Vestal virgin. These figures, you see, have been cemented in popular culture as archetypal villains. Their horrific deeds, recounted countless times, have, in a strange way, become desensitizing. Tonight, our journey takes us into even more unsettling realms. We will explore rulers whose names may not be immediately familiar, yet whose actions eclipsed even Caligula's wildest excesses. Individuals who molded the apparatus of imperial authority into a tool for self-indulgence so profound that chroniclers of the era, some of whom witnessed Nero's reign, actively refrained from recording the full extent of their depravities. Caracalla, who forced his own mother to be complicit in a matricidal horror, and then worse. Valentinian Worse, whose fury became so immense it ruptured his own skull. Constans, whose unique penchant for young foreign men necessitated alterations to palace design. Hadrian, who sacrificed his beloved for eternal existence. Valentinian III, who weaponized the wives of senators as instruments of his dominance. Maximinus Thrax, the colossal 8-foot emperor whose desires inflicted physical devastation on women. Valens, who entangled arcane magic with imperial rule until fate itself struck back at Adrianople. These individuals didn't merely misuse their authority. They laid bare the consequences when unchecked dominion encounters desires that acknowledge no limits. When the emperor's whim becomes the sole decree. When even intimates are reduced to components in ceremonies that would appall the gods themselves. Hadrian reclaims Antinous from the depths one final time, not in an act of rescue, but to murmur into an ear that can no longer hear. He speaks of which aspects of the young man will be immortalized in sculptures throughout the empire. He articulates how demise is merely the initiation of unending service. He speaks of cravings that defy even the confines of mortality. The sacred order who bore witness to this rite, assisting with celestial computations and supplying the requisite chants, swore oaths of perpetual silence, which they reportedly upheld until their dying breaths. Or so it was believed. That is, until archaeologists unearthing artifacts near Antinopolis unearthed ancient papyrus scrolls concealed within clay vessels. These texts, inscribed in Coptic by Egyptian priests, conveyed a desperate plea for someone, sometime, to comprehend the true events of a god's creation from a slain youth. This, then, is their sworn account. Prior to delving deeper into these lost narratives of dominion and depravity, if uncovering history's concealed realities resonates with you, please consider pressing the like button and subscribing for similar explorations. Furthermore, I invite you to share in the comments section where you're tuning in from. I find it truly remarkable that we are collectively examining these archaic tales, spanning continents and centuries, united by our mutual fascination with bygone eras. Marcus Aurelius Antoninus, better known as Caracalla due to his preference for a Gallic tunic, ascended to the imperial seat with his brother Geta in 211 AD. Their father, Septimius Severus, had compelled them to co-govern, believing shared authority would avert internal conflict. Instead, he inadvertently set the stage for a fratricide, with their mother as the unwilling spectator. The imperial residence was literally partitioned between the siblings, distinct entrances, separate retinues, individual dining chambers. Their sole channel of communication was their mother, Julia Domna, who traversed her own household daily, navigating between two antagonistic factions. Her private rooms became the only impartial territory, making them the unwitting stage for Caracalla's scheme. The assassination itself was rapid, but the ensuing events unveil a profound atrocity. Before Geta's blood had congealed, Caracalla initiated a thorough campaign to obliterate his brother's very memory. 20,000 individuals perished in the subsequent purges. Not solely Geta's adherents, but anyone who had ever offered him a kind word, regarded him favorably, or neglected to express adequate glee at his demise. The damnatio memoriae, or condemnation of memory, far exceeded conventional Roman custom. Geta's name was meticulously erased from public monuments, his likeness defaced in family art, and his effigies melted for new uses. Yet, Caracalla pushed these boundaries even further. He compelled artists to alter private frescoes, expunging Geta from convivial dinner depictions. He ordered the destruction of Geta's childhood playthings. He even executed the household staff who had nurtured both brothers, simply because they retained memories of a time when two imperial siblings lived. Even more unsettling were Caracalla's impositions upon Julia Domna. She was prohibited from mourning, not only in public view, but also in the solitude of her private chambers. Caracalla deployed informants among her staff, who relayed any indication of sorrow. She was mandated to present a cheerful demeanor at official events. She was compelled to laud Caracalla's singular dominion. She was forced to feign ignorance of her younger son's very existence, even as his blood remained upon her garments, precisely because Caracalla had decreed their preservation. Historical accounts, notably those of Cassius Dio, an eyewitness to these happenings, intimate a far more sinister aspect to Caracalla's connection with his mother. The emperor, having just slain his brother in her embrace, subsequently insisted she share his sleeping quarters, not in a symbolic partnership of governance, but as a literal substitute for the consorts he disregarded. The textual evidence is phrased with circumspection, yet exhibits uniformity across multiple chroniclers. Caracalla repudiated his spouse, Fulvia Plautilla, banishing her to Lipari, where she was later put to death. He never formally remarried. Instead, Julia Domna began appearing at state functions in capacities typically reserved for empresses, not imperial mothers. She hosted guests within Caracalla's bedchamber. She joined him in military encampments, where they occupied shared lodgings, a situation that scandalized even veteran legionaries. Herodian, whose writings are contemporaneous, details a shift in Julia Domna's presentation. Subsequent to Geta's murder, she adopted hairstyles characteristic of much younger women. Her attire grew more revealing, despite her advancing years. These were not her personal inclinations. Caracalla imposed her aesthetic, remaking his mother into a figure tailored to desires that even the Romans of that era struggled to articulate. Julia Domna's Syrian heritage introduced an additional layer of complexity. Caracalla developed an intense preoccupation with Eastern esoteric practices, especially those featuring divine familial unions. He cited Dionysian sibling marriages, Persian traditions of preserving blood purity, and ancient myths of deities who cohabited with their mothers to engender new realities. His intention was less to rationalize his deeds and more to consecrate them. Testimonies from palace slaves, preserved on Egyptian papyri, describe sounds emanating from the imperial bedchamber, indicating Julia Domna's torment transcended mere emotional distress. They recounted her appearing with contusions that cosmetics failed to conceal. They noted physicians attending to wounds indicative of forceful encounters. They documented her entreating servants for contraceptives or abortifacients. Her public persona, however, remained unwavering. Julia Domna participated in Senate sessions, minted coinage bearing her effigy, and supported scholarly pursuits. She was acclaimed as Mother of the Senate, Mother of the Camps, honorifics imbued with a chilling irony given the private demands of her biological son. This charade persisted for 6 years, until Caracalla's assassination in 217 AD. Upon learning of his demise, witnesses report Julia Domna laughing for the first time since Geta's murder. She then deliberately abstained from food and refused medical intervention for concealed breast cancer, succumbing within weeks. Some interpreted her death as sorrow for her son. Others perceived it as liberation from her prolonged suffering. Yet, even in death, tranquility eluded her. Caracalla had left precise directives for their joint interment, specifying their bodies be placed in a manner implying perpetual intimacy. The Roman priesthood, aghast yet compliant, executed these final wishes. To this day, beneath Syrian dunes, a mother and son rest, positioned in death precisely as he had dictated their arrangement in life. The year 375 AD on the Danube frontier. Emperor Valentinian I hosts delegates from the Quadi tribe within his campaign tent. Their mission, to broker a peace treaty. Unbeknownst to them, they are about to observe a demise that forensic historians continue to examine as one of antiquity's most explosive cerebrovascular incidents. Valentinian commences with an initial composure, his voice measured as he enumerates the Quadi's breaches of their accord. However, as his discourse progresses, onlookers discern alarming transformations. His temples throb visibly, his complexion transitions from crimson to deep violet. Spittle erupts with escalating force. His speech loses coherence, devolving into guttural utterances, until it ceases to be human language altogether, becoming primal roars of wrath. Then he physically ruptures. Cranial blood vessels rupture with such intensity that blood gushes from his nostrils, ears, and by some reports, even his eyes. He crumples, seized by convulsions, expiring. within minutes from what later medical practitioners would identify as a catastrophic hemorrhagic stroke, triggered by sheer, unadulterated rage. This wasn't his inaugural outburst, merely his final one. Valentinian had systematically deployed his wrath as a weapon throughout his 11-year rule, harnessing a tempestuous temper as a governing instrument that left his court terrified and his populace deeply scarred. Yet, this fury was far from indiscriminate. It was calculated, tactical, and frequently manifested with a sexual undertone. Ammianus Marcellinus, who served directly beneath Valentinian, chronicles the emperor's judicial proceedings with unsettling precision. When confronted with alleged traitors, Valentinian did not simply decree their deaths. He compelled entire families to witness intricate tortures. Enhanced by particular provisos, wives would be disrobed and scrutinized for any telltale signs of complicity. Daughters would undergo examinations for any awareness of their father's transgressions. This investigative methodology involved escorting women to private chambers where Valentinian personally oversaw the interrogations. These sessions extended for hours. Women emerged trembling, their garments rent, incapable of articulating the horrors they had endured. Some never reappeared. Their remains later discovered in the Danube, bearing marks that indicated the interrogation had morphed into something altogether different. The recurring nature of these events led aristocratic households to devise desperate tactics. When summoned to court, they would present their less comely daughters or their aged wives, in a vain attempt to mitigate the emperor's attention. This seldom proved effective. Valentinian's desires were not predicated on aesthetic appeal, but on sheer dominance, on shattering what others held dear, on asserting that no boundary was impervious to his grasp. One particular episode remains etched in court archives. A senator named Maximus faced charges of malfeasance. During his hearing, Valentinian commanded Maximus's wife to be produced to corroborate testimony. Before the entire assembly, he ordered her attire to be severed with blades, purportedly in pursuit of concealed papers. Discovering nothing, he asserted she must have ingested them and mandated an internal examination, which he personally oversaw. The objective was pure degradation. Maximus capitulated, admitting to offenses he had not committed solely to terminate his wife's anguish. She endured the ordeal, but remained voiceless thereafter, withdrawing into a profound silence that persisted until her eventual demise years later. The court understood the grim implication. Defying Valentinian meant enduring the desecration of all you cherished, under the legal guise of imperial justice. His association with his own empress, Justina, was no less disturbing. He would exhibit her nude throughout military encampments, proclaiming it a display of Roman pulchritude for the barbarian auxiliaries. He would compel her to serve wine at feasts adorned solely in jewelry, then proffer her to favored generals. She acquiesced, for refusal guaranteed death, not only for herself, but for her offspring. The imperial bureaucracy facilitated these atrocities. Valentinian elevated functionaries based on their readiness to acquire whatever the emperor coveted. A prefect named Maximinus ascended through the ranks by fulfilling increasingly peculiar demands: Gallic twins, Syrian virgins, boys resembling a youthful Alexander. The acquisition apparatus stretched across the vast empire, a colossal state-sanctioned network of human trafficking. Military campaigns transformed into excursions for human trophies. Following victories over Germanic tribes, Valentinian would personally choose captives, not for servitude, but for his personal repository. He showed a distinct preference for the daughters of tribal leaders, housing them in specialized quarters where he could assert Roman supremacy through methodical abuse. The imperial court devised elaborate euphemisms for these acts. Private consultation signified sexual assault. Enhanced interrogation implied intimate torment. Imperial inspection indicated the emperor would be visiting wives and daughters while their husbands and fathers remained waiting outside. Everyone comprehended the veiled language. None dared speak forthrightly. His demise brought a palpable sense of deliverance that chroniclers barely managed to disguise. The Quadi delegates who observed his violent end remarked that Roman courtiers appeared more stunned by the sudden cessation of his reign than saddened by his passing. His son, Gratian, discreetly liberated the women confined in his father's private chambers. Though the majority were too profoundly damaged to reintegrate into ordinary existence. The physiological particulars of Valentinian's death continue to captivate historians, as they imply a direct correlation between his savage desires and his explosive demise. The identical fury that propelled him to such brutality ultimately recoiled upon itself, annihilating the very cerebrum that had devised such imaginative cruelty. His terminal blood pressure likely exceeded 250, a force adequate to literally rupture the arteries within his brain. In January of 350 AD, Constans I makes his desperate escape through thick snow, hounded by the forces of the usurper Magnentius. He finds himself deserted by his own legions, who have at last reached their breaking point with a ruler whose predilections undermined military order, jeopardized foreign policy, and affronted fundamental Roman ideals of manhood. He perishes in solitude within a fortified estate, forsaken by individuals who once pledged allegiance but could no longer countenance the depravities they were forced to facilitate. Constans had governed the western third of the Roman dominion since 337 AD, a legacy inherited from his father, Constantine the Great. Yet, where Constantine had dedicated his vigor to religious reforms and military expansion, Constans directed his attention to amassing a collection of striking barbarian youths, much as other emperors acquired works of art. This practice commenced during standard military reviews. Constans would visit border fortifications, ostensibly inspecting defenses. In truth, he was scouting. When Germanic tribes dispatched hostages to secure agreements, Constans personally chose which ones would remain. His criteria were unwavering: male, youthful, fair-haired, tall, and endowed with what historical writers discreetly termed savage comeliness. These choices were not arbitrary acquisitions, but part of a structured initiative. Constans instituted what he designated the Sacred Company, a nomenclature echoing the Theban military contingent comprised of male couples. However, this was no fighting unit. These were decorative guards, instructed in ritualized combat, emphasizing bodily exhibition over actual martial prowess. The daily customs within Constans' court appalled conventional Romans. The emperor would often awaken at midday, having spent his mornings in private chambers with a rotating retinue from his assemblage. Afternoons were devoted to observing his barbarians wrestle unclothed, their forms gleaming with oil, the contests meticulously arranged for visual allure rather than genuine rivalry. Evenings featured lavish feasts where these young men functioned as living adornments, strategically placed around the dining hall in postures that accentuated their physical endowments. Military leaders voiced grievances that Constans routinely halted entire campaigns to procure particular individuals. During diplomatic talks with the Franks, he noticed the chieftain's son, a young man named Clodomer, whose hair was likened to spun gold. Constans instantly reconfigured the entire treaty to stipulate Clodomer's inclusion as a hostage, ceding strategic territories that compromised Roman borders, purely to obtain this single, handsome boy. The preferential treatment extended to these foreigners set perilous precedents. They were granted Roman citizenship without military obligation. They commanded emoluments surpassing those of seasoned legionaries. They donned togas edged in imperial purple, a distinction reserved for the aristocracy. Authentic Roman soldiers, observed as unproven foreign youths, received accolades that their own veterans earned through decades of grueling service. Even more unsettling were the clandestine rites orchestrated by Constans. Drawing upon various mystery cults, he fashioned ceremonies that fused Germanic heathenism with official Roman observances. These involved nocturnal assemblies in subterranean vaults where barbarian boys were inducted into holy arcana, which seemingly comprised chiefly of acts that contravened both Roman statutes and their native tribal customs. A Frank named Silvanus, who later achieved distinction as a Roman general, left a cryptically worded memoir of his tenure within Constance's retinue. He recounts being chosen at the age of 14, spending 3 years in circumstances he likened to luxurious imprisonment. He was instructed in Latin, Greek, and specialized physical disciplines entirely unrelated to linguistics. He learned to foresee the emperor's dispositions, to arrange his body for maximum aesthetic effect, and to feign fervor for practices that Germanic society deemed utterly abhorrent. The bureaucratic infrastructure underpinning Constance's acquisitions was extensive. Scouts patrolled all borders, identifying prospective candidates. Merchants received payment for intel on attractive young men in barbarian lands. Diplomatic delegations incorporated appraisals of local boys alongside strategic military intelligence. The empire's foreign policy progressively skewed towards obtaining human adornments for the imperial assemblage. Certain barbarian factions learned to capitalize on this vulnerability. The Alemanni would exhibit their most handsome young men during negotiations, deploying them as leverage. The Vandals dispatched carefully chosen youths as tributes to secure advantageous agreements. The Sarmatians presented twin brothers, fabled to be the most captivating males of the steppes, receiving in return military aid that enabled them to overpower competing tribes. The Roman Senate grew progressively uneasy with an emperor who appeared more preoccupied with foreign flesh than with governing Rome. Sessions attended by Constans were often interrupted by his favored companions, who would recline at his feet, being fed grapes while senators debated imperial policy. Crucial legislation was neglected as Constans engaged in hushed conversations with fair-haired youths who spoke fractured Latin. The ultimate breaking point arrived when Constans sought to legally wed one of his favorites, a Vandal prince named Wulfila. Roman jurisprudence offered no precedent for same-sex unions, particularly between an emperor and a barbarian. Constans endeavored to forge such a framework, introducing laws that would have fundamentally reshaped Roman doctrines of matrimony, citizenship, and succession. The legions finally staged a revolt. Magnentius, a military leader himself of part barbarian ancestry, understood how to channel the army's revulsion into a full-scale uprising. He vowed to restore Roman honor, to cleanse the court of its perfumed young men, and to reassert the empire's virility. The soldiers who had observed Constans caressing Germanic youths while neglecting border security rallied enthusiastically to Magnentius's banner. Constance's demise was particularly ignominious. Deserted by his handsome barbarians who fled at the slightest hint of peril, he expired pleading for quarter from the very soldiers who had once guarded him. His final utterances, according to observers, inquired after Wulfila's safe escape. The Vandal prince, in fact, had allied with Magnentius, furnishing intelligence on Constans' whereabouts in exchange for safe return to his homeland. October 130 AD. The waters of the Nile, close to Hermopolis. The imperial vessel navigates the murky currents as Emperor Hadrian presides over a rite unknown to the Egyptian clergy. At the heart of this ceremony lies Antinous, the emperor's intimate, youthful, striking, and poised to become either a sacrificial offering or a self-immolation, depending on the hushed narrative one credits. Hours afterward, Antinous lies lifeless in the river. Hadrian surfaces from his quarters, fundamentally altered, recounting epiphanies and celestial pronouncements. Within days, he proclaimed Antinous a deity. Within months, a complete metropolis materialized from the desert sands. Over ensuing years, Antinous's religious observances proliferated throughout the dominion like an epidemic, each sanctuary a testament to affection or assassination, or a more sinister fusion of the two. Hadrian, at 54, first encountered Antinous in Bithynia. The boy, likely around 14, was chosen from the local aristocracy for a beauty so profound that ancient writers found it challenging to articulate without themselves lapsing into adoration. Surviving sculptures portray a youth whose visage fused masculine power with delicate grace, his physique embodying the Greek aesthetic of youthful perfection. Their liaison caused uproar even among Romans accustomed to pederasty. This was no conventional Erastes eromenos dynamic, with its pedagogical justifications and temporary nature. Hadrian neglected state affairs to journey with Antinous. He commissioned hundreds of artworks depicting the boy in various states of nudity. He composed verses so graphic that imperial scribes declined to transcribe them, deeming them unsuitable for posterity. The expedition to Egypt in 130 AD was ostensibly for administrative purposes, to assess provincial governance. Instead, it devolved into what observers characterized as a pilgrimage of arcane inquiry, with Hadrian seeking counsel from sorcerers, engaging in subterranean ceremonies, and pursuing a knowledge that increasingly demanded Antinous' participation in perilous rituals. Egyptian priests, under duress, later recounted Hadrian's specific fascinations. He was not interested in typical benedictions or traditional enlightenment. He craved precise understanding of extending life, transposing souls, and forging divine entities through human offering. He immersed himself especially in the narratives of Osiris, where mortality and rebirth are interwoven with carnal acts. On the fateful night of Antinous' death, the imperial barge had anchored at a location Hadrian had chosen for its celestial importance. Mars, Venus, and Mercury were aligned in a cosmic arrangement that Egyptian astrological lore linked to profound metamorphosis. The emperor had dismissed all staff, retaining only a Syrian magician named Pancrates and 2 deaf-mute slaves, ensuring no verifiable report of the proceedings. The official narrative maintained Antinous' accidental fall into the water. The hushed whispers claimed he leaped willingly to fulfill a prophecy promising an extension of Hadrian's life. The most ominous conjecture proposed neither mishap nor self-sacrifice, but a ritualized killing, with Hadrian drowning his beloved at the peak of intimacy to seize his soul at its most potent state. The subsequent events lend credence to the most sinister interpretation. Hadrian's immediate conduct was not that of a bereaved lover, but of one systematically executing a preordained strategy. He established Antinopolis precisely at the site of the death. He deified Antinous before the corpse had grown cold. He inaugurated arcane mysteries whose adherents were bound by oaths of secrecy, punishable by death. A penalty several endured rather than disclose. The cult of Antinous, which disseminated throughout the empire, deviated from any standard imperial worship. These were not sanctuaries for state rituals, but loci for nocturnal observances demanding initiation. Participants recounted experiencing Antinous' presence in manners suggesting more than mere symbolism. They detailed visions of the young man that were overtly carnal, encounters that left corporeal traces, and possessions that altered their very identities. Hadrian himself underwent transformations after Antinous' passing that unnerved his court physicians. He would utter words in voices not his own, occasionally echoing the deceased youth with unsettling precision. He would fall into profound trances, during which he reportedly performed actions his conscious self could not recall. He aged with startling swiftness, as if the magic he had pursued had recoiled, siphoning away his years rather than bestowing them. The extensive architectural initiatives Hadrian commenced defied fiscal logic. Over 2,000 statues of Antinous were commissioned, a number exceeding any figure save Augustus. Temples were erected in 30 different cities. Coins emblazoned with the boy's likeness inundated the monetary system. Games commemorating his godhood necessitated imperial subventions that burdened state coffers. This was not grief, but something more compulsive, more frantic, as though Hadrian sought to reanimate in stone what he had extinguished in flesh. Personal correspondence, unearthed in Egyptian monasteries, hints that Hadrian genuinely believed he had achieved a form of immortalization. He details conversations with Antinous taking place years after the drowning. He recounts physical intimacies that left him drained and scarred. He asserted that the boy's anima inhabited various sculptures, moving between them by volition. The cultic practices of Antinous synthesized Egyptian rites of passage for the dead with Hellenic eroticism. Initiates were compelled to undergo a symbolic submersion, followed by a ritual rebirth through actions that reenacted Hadrian's connection with the divinized adolescent. These observances generated controversy even in cities familiar with esoteric faiths, with accounts of participants emerging physically and psychologically altered. Contemporary archaeological findings corroborate the anomalous nature of Antinous sites. Sculptures bear evidence of consistent anointment with compounds that defy chemical identification. Temple substructures incorporate chambers devoid of apparent architectural function, yet possessing acoustic qualities that produce disorienting sensations. Interments in proximity to Antinous shrines reveal bodies arranged in postures indicative of ceremonial death, rather than natural passing. Hadrian dedicated his twilight years to an escalating preoccupation with reuniting with Antinous. He sought counsel from every oracle, magus, and mystic across the empire. He attempted rituals demanding ingredients so horrific that purveyors declined imperial orders. His demise in 138 AD was preceded by weeks of feverish delirium, during which he implored Antinous either to claim him or set him free. The matter of succession was complicated by documents Hadrian had bequeathed, requesting funerary arrangements that transgressed Roman traditions and statutes. He desired his remains to be placed alongside effigies of Antinous in poses signifying perpetual embrace. His successor, Antoninus Pius, largely disregarded these directives, though whispers endured that specific demands were covertly satisfied. On the 16th of March, 455 AD, within Rome's Campus Martius, Emperor Valentinian III hons his archery skills as two figures approach him from the rear. He fails to recognize them as the spouses and patriarchs of the women he had defiled. The initial blade enters beneath his ribs. The second severs his jugular. As his lifeblood stains the meticulously trimmed lawn, they articulate precisely whose wives and daughters he had claimed, ensuring he comprehends the reason for his imminent death. Valentinian had inherited the Western Roman Empire at the tender age of 6, governing under the regency of his mother, Galla Placidia, until his maturity. Upon assuming personal authority, he unveiled desires that unsettled even the jaded Roman nobility. This wasn't the homosexual inclination seen in some emperors, nor the incestuous fixations of others. Valentinian precisely aimed his transgressions at the wives and daughters of influential Romans, employing defilement as a strategy of political subjugation. His methodology was systematic. Valentinian would summon senators for council, demanding they present their families as a token of allegiance. During these assemblies, he would arrange for wives and daughters to be sequestered for private audiences, while their husbands and fathers continued to deliberate on state matters. These private encounters transpired in chambers bordering the main meeting halls, sufficiently near that sounds permeated through deliberately thin walls. The communicated message was unequivocal. Your authority is inconsequential. Your kin are my possession. Your women are imperial chattel. Senators would endure policy debates, hearing their wives anguish through the intervening walls, compelled to preserve their composure lest they face accusations of treason. The degradation was compounded by the necessity of expressing gratitude to the emperor afterward, lauding his sagacity while their violated women stood silently beside them. Petronius Maximus, a senator whose spouse Valentinian had repeatedly demanded, commenced meticulously cataloging this recurring horror. His journal, concealed for centuries, meticulously chronicles dates, names, and subsequent repercussions. Some women chose suicide rather than face further summons. Others were repudiated by husbands unable to tolerate the ignominy. Many retreated into cloistered religious orders, seeking refuge in a life of faith. One particular incident escalated beyond even Valentinian's customary transgressions. Licinius Maxima, the daughter of a formidable general, was betrothed to a young senator. Valentinian summoned her under the pretext of discussing wedding arrangements, asserting imperial interest in noble unions. She never returned to her home unviolated. Her fiancé discovered her the following dawn in the palace gardens, her garments ripped, her body scarred, her mind irrevocably shattered. Her father, the general, demanded retribution. Valentinian retaliated by ordering his arrest for sedition, citing evidence that implied he was plotting violence against the emperor. This evidence was, in fact, authentic. The general had indeed been formulating such a plan. But Valentinian's clandestine intelligence network had provided advance notice, enabling him to neutralize a threat while retaining the daughter for ongoing exploitation. The administrative framework facilitated systematic depredation. Palace rendezvous were meticulously scheduled to guarantee a steady influx of new victims. Medical personnel were compelled to discreetly attend to injuries. Servants who observed these activities were reassigned to remote border outposts, where life expectancy was notoriously short. The entirety of the imperial court transformed into an engine of exploitation. International relations deteriorated as Valentinian's notoriety spread. Barbarian tribal leaders declined to send their daughters as diplomatic pledges. Allied monarchies would not countenance marital negotiations that necessitated women traveling to Rome. Even tributary payments diminished, as rulers grew apprehensive that their emissaries' wives might draw the emperor's notice. The culmination arrived when Valentinian chose an ill-fated target. Historical accounts differ on whether she was Maximus's spouse or Heraclius's daughter, yet agreement stands regarding the outcome. The husbands and fathers of abused women forged a conspiracy that overcame political animosities. Senators who had been adversaries united in their collective degradation. The assassination was intentionally conspicuous and savage. They desired Valentinian to endure suffering commensurate with that of their women. The 16 wounds discovered on his cadaver were not arbitrary, but deliberate, each signifying a particular woman he had defiled. The killers alternated in proclaiming names as they struck. This for Lucilla, this for Marcella, this for Claudia. Subsequent to Valentinian's death, evidence surfaced that laid bare the full extent of his depravities. Rosters of summoned women, categorized by his gratification levels. Medical records detailing post-assault treatments. financial ledgers itemizing payments to families for their silence. The institutionalization of sexual violence was more appalling than any single occurrence, demonstrating systemic intimate aggression as state doctrine. Petronius Maximus briefly seized the imperial throne after Valentinian's assassination, but his rule endured merely 77 days. He had participated in the slaying to avenge his wife, yet then wed Valentinian's widow, Eudoxia, coercing her into the very predicament her late husband had imposed on others. Her response was to invite the Vandals to plunder Rome, preferring barbarian subjugation to the ongoing hypocrisy of Roman rule. The Vandal sack of 455, occurring swiftly after Valentinian's death, is frequently attributed to military frailty, but contemporaneous accounts imply a more personal motive. Eudoxia furnished the Vandal king Gaiseric with rosters of senators who had facilitated Valentinian's behaviors. The Vandals specifically targeted these households, seizing their women as captives, compelling Roman men to experience the same impotence they had suffered under their own emperor. The year is 237 AD, within a military encampment on the Rhine frontier. Maximinus Thrax occupies a specially reinforced throne, which groans audibly beneath his mass. Before him, Germanic prisoners are categorized for various destinations: the male combatants destined for auxiliary service or gladiatorial death, the women and children to be sold into bondage. But Maximinus selects for an altogether different purpose. He gestures toward a young woman, statuesque and robust, characteristic of her tribal lineage. She is escorted to his private pavilion. She emerges hours later, if indeed she emerges, her gait betraying severe pelvic trauma, suggestive of an attempt to accommodate an anatomy fundamentally incompatible with typical human proportions. Maximinus reportedly towered over 8 feet, as per ancient records, his physique surpassing ordinary human dimensions in every respect. His hands could entirely envelop a man's cranium. His brute force enabled him to crumple armor with his bare digits, yet it was his carnal desires that truly appalled, necessitating alterations to furnishings, structural designs, and even his victims, to accommodate physical realities that verged on the inconceivable. The operational demands of Maximinus's private life necessitated highly specialized acquisition. Ordinary women, even those who consented, could not withstand encounters without sustaining severe harm. His operatives sought out particular physical types: tall, heavily built, with skeletal structures that might tolerate immense pressure. Germanic and Dacian women were favored, as their populations yielded individuals closer to his colossal stature. Medical reports from the physicians who tended to the aftermath recount injuries typically associated with military sieges: lacerated tissues requiring surgical intervention, dislocated pelvic joints from positions exceeding anatomical bounds, and internal hemorrhaging from organs displaced by penetration. Some women perished during these encounters, their bodies simply succumbing to strains they were never designed to bear. The emperor's exasperation with these inherent constraints spurred increasingly drastic measures. He ordered the creation of specialized apparatus, essentially mechanical contraptions, designed to support and safeguard partners while facilitating access. He experimented with pharmacological agents intended to relax musculature and alleviate pain. He pursued arcane remedies from Eastern esotericists who professed the ability to modify human physical capabilities. One historical record details Maximinus's endeavor to couple with a woman named Claudia, chosen for her extraordinary height and robustness. She underwent weeks of preparation, including specific exercises, nutritional supplements, and progressive stretching using instruments of escalating dimensions. The act itself required 4 attendants to position and brace her. She survived, but never regained normal ambulation, spending her remaining years confined to a wheelchair. The military cantonment's ethos surrounding Maximinus mirrored his insatiable desires. Soldiers vied to locate women capable of gratifying their emperor, viewing this pursuit as another conquest. Tribes learned to present their largest women as homage, occasionally breeding individuals specifically for their stature, akin to selective livestock husbandry. The dehumanization was absolute, with human beings reduced to engineering challenges to sate imperial depravity. Official appearances demanded meticulous staging to conceal any repercussions. Women who had endured these encounters were sequestered until physical recovery disguised their injuries. Those who perished were officially reported as succumbing to sudden ailments. Families received restitution or were coerced into silence. The entire empire engaged in a collective deception, feigning ignorance of the undeniable truth. The psychological toll on Maximinus himself was significant. Classical texts imply a growing fury within him as genuine physical gratification remained elusive. He would demolish furnishings after unsuccessful liaisons. He put to death servants incapable of procuring suitable companions. His brutality, both on the battlefield and in his private quarters, converged into a singular manifestation of thwarted power. Some historians posit that Maximinus's gigantism stemmed from a pituitary gland disorder, which would have induced hormonal dysregulation, impacting both his physical growth and sexual drive. Contemporary endocrinology acknowledges correlations between an overabundance of growth hormone and an amplified libido. His medical condition may have generated desires that his very affliction rendered unattainable. The financial burden of sustaining Maximinus's insatiable demands severely depleted imperial coffers. Bespoke furniture, medical attention for his victims, elaborate procurement operations, and reparations for families necessitated expenditures that dwarfed the revenues of minor provinces. Soldiers harbored resentment over resources allocated to their emperor's unattainable cravings, while they themselves lacked fundamental provisions. His demise in 238 AD was at the hands of his own troops during the siege of Aquileia. They murdered him in his slumber, perhaps the only instance he was truly susceptible. His head was dispatched to Rome on a pike, but his colossal physique required specialized conveyance. Even in death, he posed logistical dilemmas uncommon for ordinary individuals. In the summer of 376 AD, within the imperial palace of Constantinople, Emperor Valens orchestrates a clandestine ceremony in rooms officially not on any blueprint. Smoke from smoldering botanicals chokes the air. The women positioned in ritualized arrangements are either heavily sedated or exceptionally disciplined, maintaining utter stillness despite the actions being performed upon their forms. At the core of the rite, Syrian mystics guarantee they are unlocking portals to powers that will ensure Valens's eternal dominion. Instead, they are inadvertently paving the way to Adrianople, where Gothic mounted warriors will annihilate the Eastern Roman legions and Valens himself. Engulfed in a conflagration that eyewitnesses swore blazed with an unnatural intensity. Valens governed the Eastern Empire from 364 AD, receiving his authority from his brother, Valentinian I, who assumed control of the West. Whereas Valentinian expressed his brutality through outbursts of fury and carnal appetite, Valens channeled his into an esoteric pursuit that converted the palace into a veritable laboratory for blending sensuality with black magic. His initial foray into these practices was defensive. Valens harbored anxieties of magical assaults from contenders, leading him to consult specialists in counter-sorcery. Yet, self-defense soon morphed into aggression, and defense into a profound craving. And before long, the emperor was presiding over rituals that demanded ingredients. Ancient scribes declined to name, referring to them as unutterable requirements that transgressed both sacred and universal ordinances. Ammianus Marcellinus, our foremost historical authority, recounts perpetual magical tribunals in Constantinople. But these were not campaigns against sorcerers. They were systematic removals of rivals. Valens sought an absolute monopoly on occult power, executing anyone who might possess knowledge he coveted or faculties that menaced his burgeoning practices. The retinue Valens gathered defied conventional Roman hierarchies. Egyptian necromancers who professed converse with the deceased, Persian magi who pledged dominion over intellect, Thracian enchantresses versed in mind-altering botanicals, Syrian temple courtesans who performed sacred rites purportedly channeling celestial forces. The imperial residence became a nexus for every prohibited mystical tradition within the realm. The ceremonies themselves necessitated precise constituents that procurement channels found arduous to acquire. The blood of virgins drawn at the instant of first coitus, menstrual effluvium from women experiencing their initial menses, and bodily fluids gathered during ritualized bacchanals, precisely coordinated with astronomical occurrences. These ingredients demanded complex logistical systems for their acquisition and preservation. Women involved in these rites occupied an ambiguous status, hovering between object of abuse and active participant. Some were demonstrably forced, brought to the rituals against their volition. Others appeared sincerely committed to practices that promised spiritual elevation through carnal engagement. Many existed in chemically induced stupors, rendering true consent impossible, their psyches reshaped by compounds that stripped away inhibitions and instilled suggestions. One particular rite, partially chronicled in Coptic manuscripts secreted within Egyptian monastic libraries, entailed the fabrication of what Valens termed living amulets. Women would be chosen for precise physical and astrological traits. Through a combination of ceremonies, ritual scarring, and chemical alterations, they would purportedly transform into conduits for otherworldly energies. These women were then confined to specialized chambers, their bodies serving as magical reservoirs that Valens could tap for power. The health repercussions were dire. Imperial physicians, bound by strict oaths of confidentiality, addressed ailments they could not rationalize through conventional medical knowledge. Women aged by decades within mere months, their hair whitened overnight. Some manifested abilities that appeared genuinely paranormal, foretelling deaths, perceiving remote occurrences, speaking tongues they'd never learned. Others simply descended into madness, their intellects fractured by experiences that surpassed human comprehension. The political ramifications were no less unsettling. Valens deployed supernaturally acquired intelligence to eliminate adversaries before they could mobilize. He would uncover conspiracies through methods that deeply unnerved logical Romans. Senators discovered their concealed deliberations exposed, their private discussions reiterated, their unvoiced aspirations exploited for imperial leverage. Foreign policy integrated arcane warfare. Prior to encounters with Gothic warlords, Valens would perform rituals aimed at influencing their cognitive processes. Emissaries recounted experiencing inexplicable urges, consenting to terms they had not intended, and feeling an attraction to the emperor that contradicted their personal inclinations. Whether this constituted authentic sorcery or advanced drug-assisted psychological manipulation remains a subject of contention. The Gothic conflict, culminating at Adrianople, was precipitated by a catastrophic magical error. Valens undertook an elaborate rite intended to guarantee triumph, demanding ingredients so radical that even his Syrian mystics voiced their apprehension. The ceremony involved the immolation of women who had been specifically readied through months of ritualistic preparation, their demises synchronized with celestial conjunctions purportedly ensuring divine blessing. Instead, something went terribly awry. Witnesses depict anomalous occurrences during the ritual, temperatures plummeting despite the summer season, shadows independently shifting without light source changes, and vocalizations that no human larynx could produce. Valens emerged from the ceremony altered, speaking of premonitions of his own fiery end, yet inexorably driven to march towards it nonetheless. At Adrianople, on August 9th, 378 AD, Valens met his end in a conflagration when Goths ignited a farmhouse where he had sought refuge. Eyewitnesses recounted the fire's peculiar behavior, burning with a heat far exceeding that which normal wood combustion generates, utterly consuming the emperor's body, such that no trace remained. Some hypothesized this was the magical warding recoiling, the very powers he had cultivated now turning upon their conjurer. Subsequent to his death, the palace chambers where these rituals transpired were sealed, then later dismantled. Laborers reported discovering altars stained with unidentifiable substances, wall engravings in languages predating known scripts, and structural alterations serving no logical function. Everything was systematically destroyed on the directives of Theodosius, Valens's successor, who established an assertive Christian orthodoxy, in part to purge the taint of sorcery. Consider these 7. Spanning 4 centuries, each ruler weaponized imperial power, molding it into an engine for unbridled personal indulgence. Caracalla, enveloped in his mother's blood-stained embrace. Valentinian, consumed by a rage that literally fractured his mind. Constans, amassing his collection of barbarian youths. Hadrian, submerging his beloved for the promise of eternal life. Valentinian III, methodically defiling the wives of the Roman Senate. Maximinus, whose colossal physique rendered women broken. Valens, intertwining arcane arts with dominion until the Adrianople blaze consumed him. These were not mere anomalies. They were stark unveilings of the true nature of absolute power once all inhibitions are shed. Every emperor confronted the identical allure, when every conceivable desire can be fulfilled, when no one dares deny you, when even one's own kin become mere possessions. What boundaries persist? For these 7, the resounding answer was none. The very frameworks that facilitated their practices reveal something beyond isolated perversions. The Roman Empire sustained elaborate acquisition channels capable of furnishing any craving. Bureaucratic mechanisms designed to obfuscate every transgression. Medical practitioners who attended to every consequence. And legal systems that legitimized every violation. This was not merely individual depravity, but an institutionalized potential for limitless exploitation. Each successive emperor extended the limits further than those who came before. Caracalla elevated incest to an imperial standard. Valentinian formalized sexual assault into judicial procedure. Constans enshrined pederasty as official policy. Hadrian consecrated murder as divine intervention. Valentinian III institutionalized systematic defilement. Maximinus mandated the physically impossible. Valens integrated sorcery into sovereign rule. Every new horror established a precedent for the subsequent escalation. The casualties numbered in the thousands, potentially tens of thousands. Not solely those directly abused, but entire families shattered, ancestral lines extinguished, intellects broken by observing or enduring imperial scrutiny. Each emperor left behind a trail of devastation that resonated for generations. Children burdened with inherited trauma, communities conditioned to silence, and cultures that absorbed a profound sense of subjugation. The complicity extended far beyond mere facilitators and suppliers. The entirety of the Roman aristocracy participated, through their silence, through their provisions, and through their pretense of not perceiving the self-evident. Senators who sacrificed their wives to safeguard their status. generals who delivered captives for imperial gratification, priests who sanctified atrocities as divine ordinance, physicians who ministered to wounds they recognized as criminal acts. The very foundation of the empire rested upon a collective pact to disregard imperial depravity. The surviving documentation itself narrates a chilling tale. Ancient historians resorted to encoded language, veiled euphemisms, and subtle implications. They dared not record the unvarnished truth without courting their own demise. Yet they could not entirely omit it without forfeiting their veracity. Thus, they crafted a dialect of insinuation, partial truths that hinted at wholly dreadful realities. Contemporary historians are tasked with deciphering intentionally obfuscated cruelties, piecing together the true horror from mere suggestions. The spiritual aspect transcended mere duplicity. These emperors simultaneously embodied deities and abominations, divine authority made manifest, even as they transgressed every sacred tenet. They officiated at religious rites moments after committing depravities. They promulgated ethical statutes while engaging in profound immorality. They were venerated as hallowed figures while behaving like infernal beings. This cognitive discord ultimately dismantled the Roman understanding of sanctity itself. The financial outlay was colossal. Sustaining imperial desires necessitated resources that could have equipped armies, constructed metropolises, or nourished provinces, the extensive acquisition apparatuses, the medical provisions, the reparations and hush money, the structural alterations, the elaborate ceremonies and mystic rites. All commanded expenditures that exacerbated imperial insolvency. The Western Empire did not merely succumb to barbarian incursions. It imploded under the sheer weight of its own sovereign's insatiable cravings. The military consequences were similarly dire. Legionaries who should have been battling were instead engaged in procurement. Generals who ought to have been devising strategies were facilitating depravities. Supplies intended for border defenses were rerouted to imperial indulgences. The barbarian hordes did not so much conquer Rome as stroll through portals left unguarded by emperors too consumed by their desires to register the impending invasion. The cultural reverberations lingered long after Rome's collapse. These imperial customs evolved into legendary horrors that sculpted medieval notions of wickedness. When Dante conceived his Inferno, he drew partial inspiration from Roman imperial barbarities. When medieval ethicists cautioned against power's corrupting influence, they invoked these very emperors. When Renaissance philosophers interrogated absolute rule, these were the cautionary narratives they referenced. Contemporary parallels are discomfiting yet irrefutable. Any system that centralizes power without oversight risks engendering comparable monstrosities. The apparatus of abuse, once established, actively solicits perpetrators. The networks of acquisition, once forged, demand a constant stream of victims. The ethos of silence, once normalized, permits escalating depravity. These Roman emperors are not just figures from antiquity, but perennial admonitions concerning the inherent perils of unchecked authority. Archaeological findings persist in surfacing. Excavations routinely unearth proof of practices that either validate or surpass written testimonies. Skeletal injuries consistent with described abuses, architectural elements that fulfilled recorded functions, and chemical traces that corroborate reported materials. The tangible record authenticates what initially appeared as hyperbole, indicating that the reality was more gruesome than the rhetoric. They were birthed into a lineage of terror, the progeny of these emperors, the descendants of their victims, generations inheriting a trauma etched into their very marrow. Some were the fruit of incest, others of sexual assault. many born of circumstances so extreme that Roman law possessed no categories for them, transcending legal comprehension. Caracalla's association with Julia Domna might have yielded offspring, whose existence palace records deliberately suppressed. Whispers circulated among servants of infants, born with malformations, secreted away in imperial chambers, expunged before they could become dynastic liabilities. One narrative speaks of a child who survived 3 years, confined to rooms accessible only by deaf-mute slaves, finally dispatched when its striking resemblance to both Caracalla and his mother grew unmistakable. The extensive acquisition networks that sated imperial desires frequently implicated children who matured with the chilling awareness that their existence was solely for eventual exploitation. Their indoctrination commenced early, occasionally from infancy. They were taught to comport themselves alluringly, to articulate in seductive tones, and to posture themselves for maximum aesthetic impact. By the time they reached a serviceable age, they ceased to be mere humans, transforming instead into exquisitely fashioned tools for imperial gratification. These youths occupied an unparalleled legal twilight zone. Not entirely enslaved, as some might be recognized as imperial progeny. Not truly free, since their very existence hinged upon imperial caprice. Not authentically Roman, given their purposefully veiled origins. They dwelled in the palace's penumbral spaces, granted enough schooling to be diverting, but never enough to pose a threat. Their lives extending only so long as they proved useful or diverting. Hadrian's deification of Antinous spawned a distinct kind of progeny, spiritual descendants of a fabricated deity. Throughout the empire, young individuals were inducted into Antinous cults, which offered immortality through the ritualistic reenactment of the divine youth's bond with Hadrian. These were not symbolic performances. Priests, personally instructed by Hadrian, meticulously taught initiates the precise manner in which the emperor had cherished his favorite, thereby transforming imperial desire into spiritual observance. The foreign youths amassed by Constans frequently left behind pregnant women upon their eventual dismissal. These children, half Roman yet legally classified as barbarian, introduced genealogical disorder into border territories. Neither culture laid claim to them. They possessed no inheritance rights under Roman statutes or tribal customs. They persisted as corporeal manifestations of imperial indulgence, their features serving as undeniable markers of abuse, veiled as patronage. The progeny of Maximinus Thrax presented singular difficulties. Children who inherited his colossal stature could neither be concealed nor disregarded. They were conspicuous, both literally and figuratively, their immense size broadcasting their imperial lineage. Some were put to death at birth when their scale became evident. Others were assigned to specialized military units tasked with handling imperial disgraces. A select few reached maturity, their formidable builds making them valuable as warriors, yet perilous as potential claimants to power. The systemic abuses under Valentinian III gave rise to a generation of senatorial offspring who were aware their acknowledged fathers were not their biological progenitors. These public secrets corroded the Roman aristocracy from within. Siblings bearing no familial resemblance, sisters possessing imperial traits, inheritances disputed on the grounds of palpable, yet unspoken, realities. The emperor had, quite literally, infused Rome's elite genealogies with profound disarray. Even more unsettling were the children conceived through magical rituals under Valens. Some accounts depict infants who initially appeared conventional, but developed uncanny abilities as they matured. Children who possessed knowledge they could not have acquired, who conversed with unseen entities, who instigated inexplicable occurrences in their proximity. Most were discreetly removed when their true nature became evident. Yet persistent rumors spoke of some surviving in isolated monasteries, where their powers were purportedly contained through ceaseless supplication. The pedagogical frameworks for imperial offspring mirrored their father's specific preoccupations. They mastered languages to engage with a variety of victims. They delved into anatomy to comprehend physiological boundaries. They were tutored in jurisprudence precisely to discern legal deficiencies. Their educational path groomed them not for statesmanship, but for self-gratification, producing successive generations of rulers who perceived the empire as merely an instrument for their desires. Certain children endeavored to deviate from these established patterns. Marcus Aurelius Antoninus, son of Caracalla, though potentially also his grandson, if whispers concerning Julia Domna hold truth, attempted systemic improvements during his brief tenure as Elagabalus. However, his remedies involved novel manifestations of the same unbridled sensuality, suggesting that trauma had merely metamorphosed rather than truly abated. He was slain at 18, his corpse cast into the Tiber, eradicated just as his father had eradicated his uncle. Others, however, fully embraced their inherited legacy. They vied to surpass their progenitors' abominations, perceiving extreme conduct as both an entitlement and a duty. They founded dynasties of depravity, where each successive generation sought to outdo prior transgressions. These bloodlines did not expire naturally, but required systematic eradication through assassination, often at the hands of their own praetorians, who could no longer tolerate another generation of imperial fiends. The daughters confronted particular dilemmas. They understood intimately the tribulations endured by imperial women, having either witnessed or personally experienced them. Some transformed into tormentors themselves. Having internalized that authority meant inflicting the very suffering they had undergone. Others sought refuge in a religious existence so austere it hinted at efforts to expiate transgressions they had not personally committed but had inherited through lineage. The medical wisdom amassed from ministering to imperial offspring was conserved in texts that endured in Byzantine scriptoria. Physicians recorded conditions they could not reconcile with standard genetics. Children who rapidly senesced, as if their forms were consuming their vital essence at an accelerated pace. Others who appeared developmentally arrested despite their chronological age. And anatomical deviations implying their genesis involved energies transcending conventional biology. The metaphysical inquiry into their souls vexed Roman theology. Did children conceived through defilement, incest, or sorcery possess ordinary souls? Could they attain redemption? Were they truly human, or something else inhabiting human form? These were not abstract philosophical debates for the children themselves, who matured with the knowledge that their very being posed theological quandaries no existing doctrine could satisfactorily resolve. The fosterage systems that managed imperial illegitimate offspring forged intricate webs of covert influence. Families who reared the unacknowledged children of emperors acquired subtle power through implied affiliations. They could allude to concealed truths, insinuate their sway, and capitalize on unspoken opportunities. The empire was permeated by these unseen dynasties. Lineages that officially held no existence, yet practically dictated policy. Some children simply disappeared, dispatched to remote border garrisons, unlisted on official cartography, confined in monastic orders whose vows of silence were so profound they would not even acknowledge their own presence. Removed through methods that left no vestige. The empire had perfected the art of making individuals vanish so utterly that their very absence went unremarked. February 11th, 211 AD. Let us revisit that chamber where Julia Domna cradles Geta's chilling remains, while Caracalla observes with a gratification utterly divorced from political triumph. The blood coalescing on the polished marble would never be truly cleansed. Servants would toil for days, yet the mark would endure, faint yet perceptible, a specter that deepened in specific lighting. This very stain diffused throughout the empire, permeating its foundations, corrupting everything constructed upon them. Each succeeding emperor trod upon floors scarred by the barbarities of their forebears. Every imperial residence harbored chambers where ineffable deeds had transpired. Every regal seat bore the unseen vestiges of the fiends who had occupied it. The empire did not merely endure these horrors, it was fundamentally forged from them. The year 455 A.D. Valentinian III expires, his blood draining as his assassins intone the names of their violated wives. His lifeblood commingles with soil already saturated by centuries of analogous savagery. The verdure that springs forth will possess an uncommon darkness, nourished by the imperial depravity that has permeated the very earth. Rome has not yet crumbled, but its bedrock decays from within, enervated by rulers who devoured the very dominion they were sworn to safeguard. In 378 AD, Valens is immolated at Adrianople, in a blaze that eyewitnesses swore possessed an otherworldly intensity. The fire that devours him appears ravenous, as though exacting a toll for the powers invoked through ceremonies that defied the natural order. His ashes disperse on winds, borne across lands soon to fall under the dominion of Goths, Vandals, and Huns. The Western Empire has less than a century remaining. The Eastern Empire will persist for another millennium, yet it will never again yield emperors of such breathtaking malevolence. These were not the celebrated tyrants, not Nero or Caligula, whose appellations became bywords for profligacy. These were the overlooked, the emperors whose barbarities were too distinct, too unsettling, too illuminating of the true essence of imperial might. Their histories were quashed, not for their falsehood, but for their veracity. A truth so potent, it menaced the very bedrock of rightful governance. Caracalla illustrated that familial bonds presented no impediment to imperial craving. Valentinian evinced that legal frameworks were merely instruments for institutionalized abuse. Constans unveiled that military strength fundamentally served the acquisition of gratification. Hadrian established that affection and assassination were not only reconcilable, but synergistically intertwined. Valentinian III instituted systematic sexual assault as a matter of state policy. Maximinus personified the physical futility of satiation when power exceeded human scale. Valens fused rulership with arcane arts until the fabric of existence itself revolted. Collectively, they constitute a paradigm that surpasses individual mental aberration. They expose the inherent rationale of unconstrained power. When no act is prohibited, every act becomes imperative. When self-control vanishes, desire metastasizes endlessly. When mortals assume godlike authority, they act with demonic malevolence. The Roman Empire did not generate these fiends by chance, but as an inexorable consequence, the natural outcome of systems that centralized power devoid of oversight. The underlying frameworks they established outlived them. Acquisition networks, initiated for imperial gratification, transmuted into medieval slave markets. Administrative architectures engineered to obscure brutalities evolved into bureaucracies that normalized subjugation. Legal precepts that legitimized transgression shaped statutory codes for successive centuries. The Roman heritage encompasses not solely aqueducts and grand structures, but also methodologies for appeasing power's most sinister cravings. The evidence they sought to obliterate continues to surface. Cryptic texts embedded within monastic walls, encrypted accounts stored in ancestral repositories, archaeological findings that either corroborate or surpass existing written records. Every revelation uncovers further profound depths, intimating that our current knowledge constitutes only a fragment of the reality. The complete truth might literally defy articulation, transcending language's ability to articulate such horror. The dynastic lines they begot persist, attenuated yet discernible within populations spanning Europe, Asia, and Africa. Genetic analyses unearth unforeseen linkages, hinting at affiliations that official family trees repudiate. We bear their hereditary imprint unwittingly. Ancestral trauma inscribed within our very chromosomes, primal recollections of abuses that molded the anxieties and behaviors of succeeding generations. The theological dilemmas they provoked remain unresolved. Can spirits be tainted through corporeal acts? Does authority fundamentally alter human character, or merely expose its intrinsic nature? Are there deeds that condemn not only the transgressors, but the entire systems that enable them? These emperors compelled a confrontation with potentialities that Roman polytheism could not reconcile, thereby contributing to the ascent of Christianity as a competing faith that promised celestial retribution for terrestrial barbarities. The contemporary ramifications are disquieting, yet inescapable. Any societal construct that consolidates power risks spawning comparable abominations. The architecture of abuse, once erected, actively seeks exploiters. The ethos of complicity, once normalized, facilitates intensifying depravity. These emperors are not merely historical cautions, but possess urgent modern relevance, illustrating the outcome when responsibility vanishes and desire supplants governance. We scrutinize them not for the sake of sensationalism, but for the sake of realization. A realization that power devoid of constraint devolves into predation, that systems conceived for administration can become engines for indulgence, that mortals endowed with divine authority act with infernal ingenuity, that the pinnacles of civilization are erected upon abysses we often choose to ignore. Julia Domna departed in 217 AD. At last liberated from the son who had simultaneously made her both empress and victim, she deliberately starved herself, rejecting sustenance and medical aid, electing annihilation over continued existence in a realm fashioned by imperial barbarity. Her dying declaration, as recorded by onlookers, was, "The mark will not fade." She may have referred to Geta's blood on her garments. She may have meant the empire itself. That indelible mark persists. In the desolate ruins of palaces where atrocities unfolded, in statutory codes that sanctioned abuse, in lineages bearing genetic reverberations of imperial immoderation, in structures that centralize power without oversight, in desires that proliferate when checks are removed, and in the profound understanding that individuals granted absolute authority will inevitably succumb to its absolute corruption. These 7 emperors were not outliers, but archetypes, illustrations of the outcome when authority converges with mental aberration, when a system empowers psychopathy, when an empire transforms into an instrument for imperial caprice. They illuminated the nadir of human potential when no impediment exists to prevent its realization. The blood never truly disappeared, neither from polished marble nor from imperial regalia, nor from the collective memory of history. It seeped into subterranean foundations, polluted groundwater, despoiled the very earth. Everything erected upon those foundations bears that indelible mark. Every system derived from those structures inherits that defilement. Every aggregation of power carries the inherent risk of reawakening latent capacities for atrocity. They governed for periods ranging from decades to mere months. Yet their influence endures across millennia, not through grand monuments or legal statutes or unbroken dynasties, but through stark revelations of power's ultimate consequences. They revealed what authority becomes without oversight. What humanity becomes without self-control. What civilization becomes when its sole purpose is to satiate its ruler's desires. The imperial purple was discarded following Rome's demise, its hue too inextricably linked with barbarity to persist. Yet, purple was merely a pigment. The true stain was more profound, enduring, disseminating through systems that assimilated Roman notions of authority but lacked Roman strictures on its application. We still bear that mark, imperceptible yet pervasive, an inherited disgrace for atrocities we did not perpetrate, but from which our civilization ultimately sprang. Caracalla observes his brother's final breath in their mother's embrace, experiencing only profound contentment. Valentinian ruptures from an inner fury that ultimately consumed him. Constans flees across snowy landscapes, pursued by troops revolted by his assemblages. Hadrian submerges his beloved for an apotheosis existing solely in statuary. Valentinian III bleeds to death as the names of his victims resonate across the Campus Martius. Maximinus expires in his pavilion, his immense stature defying conventional assassination. Valens incinerates in flames that may have been arcane or simply divine retribution. They have passed, yet their revelations concerning power endure. The inherent capacity for monstrosity that authority unlocks. The apparatus of barbarity that systemic structures construct. The human inclination toward horror when all checks are removed. They were not the most reprehensible because they were not the final chapter. The contagion continues to spread. The crimson mark never truly dries. The trajectory persists. Power corrupts boundlessly, interminably, ceaselessly. As it has always been, so it is now and ever shall be, world without end. Unless we recall their demonstrations, unless we acknowledge their disclosures, unless we grasp their enduring admonition of what remains perpetually feasible, always possible, eternally possible. Wherever authority centralizes without oversight, wherever desire dictates governance, wherever mortals ascend to godhood, the grim lesson inscribes itself in an indelible, crimson testament. Absolute power does not merely corrupt utterly. It unequivocally exposes the corruption that has always lain dormant, merely awaiting sanction to manifest. These 7 emperors granted that sanction. Who grants it now? Should this brief descent into history's concealed grimness ignite a desire within you to unearth further suppressed realities, I have curated another expedition into the bygone shadows, one you'll undoubtedly wish to experience. Select the video now appearing on your display to unearth yet another astonishing passage that history attempted to obliterate. And if you found this particular investigation as captivating as I did, do consider hitting that subscribe icon, allowing us to collaboratively strip away more of history's intricate layers. These unremembered narratives rightfully demand an audience, and countless more tales patiently await their telling.